Well, hey everybody, welcome back. Today we're going to talk about our first lecture, which is interpersonal communication and just the introduction to it. What is this whole thing of the study of communication and kind of why do we do this? Just so these lectures are supplements to the readings. I don't cover everything, and I cover things that are outside of the readings. And so make sure that you are also keeping up with those to be able to get all the information that you need to be successful. So as we dive in, let's take a look here. So let's begin by talking about like what is communication? Communication is a process that we engage in with other people. It's a process of us joining together to create a shared meaning. And what a shared meaning means is that we are seeking to understand a common ground. When we think about what a root word is, like let's talk about something like, say here I've got a pen, right? Well, a pen is not the exact physical object, right? The word pen is used to describe the object. We use it as a placeholder in our minds when we are saying, okay, when we say pen, our mind goes to that. But there's different types of pens, you know what I mean? Like there's different types of writing utensils. So it helps us define it and categorize it, but it requires that we have a shared meaning for that word to make sense. If I called this a bird, well, this nobody would understand that, and it wouldn't be that shared meaning. So whatever I called it wouldn't have any meaning behind it. So it only has meaning when we have a shared meaning, when we go through that process of coming up with things together. When something new is discovered or new ideas or different social contexts are constructed, we become in the process as a society, as a group of people, to try to work through what that shared meaning is. So let's go ahead and give just a definition for interpersonal communication. It's hard to just fully define, but a good one that I ran across is interpersonal communication is the process or exchange of information, ideas, and feelings between two or more people through verbal or nonverbal methods. So interpersonal has to do with our relation, our connection, our engagement with others. There's a whole study of communication called intrapersonal communication, and that has to do with inside yourself, you speaking with yourself. But interpersonal has to do with us engaging with others. So many of you have already taken a COM 101 class, and so this model may not be anything brand new to you. However, to kind of build that foundation for this course, it's good to get a refresher on this because this model is really the basis and the foundation for all communication theory. So when we look at this diagram here, what we see is that there's this process that we engage in when we are communicating. You have one person here and another person here, and there's this process of a sender and a receiver, right? I'm going to talk to you right now. I am the sender. I'm saying words with my mouth and I'm sending that out to you. You are the receiver. Now, since this is virtual, I don't get to see your feedback on this video. I don't get to see any of that feedback coming back. But if this was face to face, you'd be giving me maybe some head nods, maybe a couple people would be falling asleep. There'd be a little bit of feedback that I'm getting there, but we don't get that in this type of environment. And that's because it has to do with the channel, right? The channel that we're using right now is virtual. It's Zoom. I'm recording this through Zoom. I'm presenting it through a PowerPoint. I'm going to upload it through Canvas. So this is all online communication. Face to face would be a different channel, and face to face is the largest bandwidth that we have for communicating. So meaning that the most amount of information we get to receive is when there is face to face, because then we get to pick up on all the nuances like nonverbals, feedback that typically wouldn't be there if it's mediated between a channel like digital, or on the phone you could still hear fluctuations of people's voices. You could hear tone, so that's a different thing. But like over a text, you don't get all those same cues, so we rely on things like emojis or something to try to portray some of those nonverbals, some of those emotions behind what we say. Now we jumped ahead a little bit, but here you kind of go back to what the message is, right? So the message is the actual thing I'm trying to portray. So as the sender, I have this idea of what I want to communicate, and I'm going to send out this message. And there's going to be verbal and nonverbal components to that. However, in all communication, there is a sense of loss in what is said, right? And that's because of interference and noise. What I say isn't fully portrayed by the other person. The only way we'd be able to do that is if we were connected, our minds were connected and we could read each other's minds. However, that's not, what we're able to do. Now, there's some stuff in the works that, you hear things like mind links and all this stuff, but we're not there yet. So until that, we aren't at the process where we are 100% effective with our communication. There is always some sense of loss. And, our channel has a lot to do with how much loss there is, but also the interference and noise, like what is going on. So for instance, as I'm recording this lecture, if there was a bunch of background noise going on, say, my neighbor's doing construction and there's all this noise, or, there's my kids are all screaming in the background, that would be distracting to the viewers. So if that's the case, then, you wouldn't be picking up on as much of what I'm trying to say because there's be all these distractions. There's also like internal interference or noise, right? So say that you're sitting in a classroom and it's right before lunchtime, you're super hungry. Well, you're going to be thinking about how you want to eat and how you want to get out of this class so you can go get lunch, rather than being able to fully pay attention. But, things like anxiety or nervousness or uncomfortability, these are all things that can kind of interfere. Sometimes, when we're communicating, we get super excited about what we want to talk about. So you almost want to jump into the conversation and throw it out, kind of interrupt people. These are all different forms of interference and noise. Now, when we're engaging in this communication process, it's not just a send and then the person receives. No, there's feedback that we're constantly getting from people. So if we were talking face to face, we would see those nonverbals. There'd be these cues, there'd be these things taking place where we'd be able to pick up on, okay, are you receiving what I'm saying? Or maybe I offended you. You look a little bit upset. These are things that you pick up with. Depending on the medium or by the channel that we use when we're communicating, that feedback can start to become limited. For instance, like when you think about like a news station, right? And they're communicating out to the masses. Well, there's not any direct feedback, especially before the days of social media, when, there would be like this TV channel and they're just projecting one message out to the masses, and there wouldn't really be any feedback back. The viewers didn't really have a voice and be able to kind of speak up whether they appreciated or didn't appreciate certain aspects of what the message was saying. Well, now with social media, there's a little bit more of that feedback, right? So for instance, let's say a TV show is taking place and it portrays a message that people get very upset about. Well, now people could go on social media, go to that, station or that show's social media profiles, and they could post and they could say, they could give that feedback, or they could give, and that could be, criticisms. We see this a lot in like cancel culture, a lot of people giving a lot of negative feedback, but it could also be it could be good feedback. Someone, you see a message or you hear something that maybe a celebrity is doing or some sort of company's doing, and you can go and give praise for that. So there's that kind of feedback that now does take place in that online world. And then another thing to kind of consider is the setting or the situation, the context that this is taking place within. What time frame is this? Is this morning? Is this night? What year is it? These all things have different settings. And that seems a little ridiculous to consider the year, but imagine you're reading a book from maybe 1970s. Well, there's going to be some things, some ways things are said that aren't going to really, fit into how things are said nowadays. However, that is a form of communication. Someone wrote something with the intention of people reading that. Well, that might be read, years down the road. think about a social media post, right? You posted something, years ago. And we see this, with celebrities, but I've seen it in people trying to get hired on at places where employers, when they're looking at hiring a candidate, they'll look at their Facebook or social media profiles, and they'll look back at some of the things they posted. And if they are representing themselves in a certain way, then they may forego employing that potential candidate. So there are these things to kind of consider when we are communicating with one another. Okay, so let's talk about encoding and decoding, right? So it's one thing for me to send out a message and for you to receive it, but there's this process of we have to encode and decode. So encoding is the process of turning our thoughts, ideas, and feelings into verbal and or nonverbal messages. And then decoding is the process of interpreting and adding meaning to the verbal or nonverbal messages we receive. So encoding is us using maybe our language, maybe our nonverbal communication, maybe other contextual situations to be able to put meaning out there. And then decoding is where the receiver then has to take that message and then decode and deconstruct it and figure out, okay, what does this mean to me? And what does this mean to my personal person, my understanding of the world? So this process takes place. It's not just I send it and you receive exactly what I'm trying to say. I think all of us can know when there's been a form of miscommunication, there's this frustration because it's like, hey, no, I sent out a message and you're not decoding this correctly. Or maybe you've been in the reverse where it's like, hey, no, I'm getting what you're saying, but I don't think you're putting out that information. You're not encoding correctly. And then we get back and forth, with our interpersonal relationships. Well, if we understand this process, we can kind of see where maybe those miscommunications are taking place. Is it in the process of encoding, or is it in the process of decoding, or is it somewhere else in the communication process that's taking place? So let's consider context, right? We mentioned this a little bit, but context is very important when it comes to interpersonal communication because, for one, there's the physical side of things, right? Where are you physically taking place in this form of communication? For me, I'm, in a doctorate's program over at a school, Regent University, which is in Virginia Beach, Virginia, which is clear across the country, right? So when I attend classes, not only am I attending in Eastern time, which is a 3-hour difference, but it's also happening in a very physically different place in the world, right? And so there are changes to how the communication takes place when I attend those classes. However, most of you, even though we're online, are still within a physical realm of Coeur d'Alene or the greater area, right? So like I live in Spokane, so there's still even a little bit of a distance there. But if we were in a physical classroom, then at the same time, at the same place, we are all performing communication. We are all engaging in that interpersonal relationship. And then there's the context of relational, right? The relational context of things. What is the context behind the relationship between you and the people you're communicating with, right? Because that changes how the communication takes place. Think about, you're not going to talk to your parents the same way you would talk to a friend, right? Or you're not going to talk to your friends the same way you would talk to like a professor, or you're not going to talk to your professor the same way you would talk to your coworker, or your coworkers to your boss, or there's all these different types of contextual relationships. If you have a boyfriend or girlfriend, well, then all of a sudden, you're going to talk to that person differently than you would maybe like a friend, right? And so these are all things that take place relationally that changes the mode of communication. It changes the whole aspect of it. So we've looked at the physical and the relational side of context, but then there's also the individual, right? Like what's going on within ourselves? Who are we when we come into these communication situations, right? Each of us have a unique background. Each of us are part of a different cultural build up, right? And so we all have different experiences that have shaped us to be who we are today. And so these things do play a part within the communication, right? If we're naturally like an introverted person, you might communicate differently than if you're naturally an extroverted person. And so there's different things that kind of take place that change the context. And then finally, there's the cultural aspect, right? What is the culture that you are engaging in this communication? If you're, here in Coeur d'Alene, you're going to communicate differently than like if you're over in Sweden, right? Or if you're in South America, or in some other different country. Even within our own country, there's different cultural differences, and so depending on where you're at, or who you're engaging with, there are those cultural differences. We live in a globalized world, meaning that we are more connected than ever before, meaning that we can engage with people that are clear across the globe, that normally without the internet and uh, different communication technologies, that wouldn't take place as often, at least. And so, when you go into, you're working for a company, right? And say you're working for a remote company, your coworker may be clear across the globe. They may have an entirely different cultural background than you do. And so understanding those differences will allow you to engage in that interpersonal communication in a more healthy and effective way. Finally, communication is irreversible. And this is the thing that, there's many different principles that fall within the communication realm, but one I really like to point out is that it's irreversible, because no matter what we say, what we post out, what we do, what we engage with other people, you can't take it back. You could do processes to kind of mediate things, right? We've all been there where we maybe said something we didn't mean, or came off wrong. And, we can express that to people. And there's the hope that there's that understanding and empathy on their part where they're able to see, okay, that this was an honest mistake. However, it still doesn't change what happens. If we say something that hurts somebody, if we act in a certain way that is, displeases people, no matter what we do to try to reverse that, it is irreversible. That does not mean that we should not try to mediate those situations when those things come up. It just is something to keep in mind. And so we need to be cognizant when we're communicating of this fact that it is irreversible. It's also important to note that communication is inevitable, right? Choosing not to say something is saying something in its own end. So it's important to understand that aspect, that no matter what, we are always communicating with people. You could go to work and you may not talk to anybody that you work with. However, that's still communicating something to people. They may think that you don't like them. They may think that you're upset, or that, the possibilities are endless with what people come up with when there isn't any more information for them to go off of. And so it's important to know that communication is irreversible and it is inevitable. No matter what, you are saying something. To people are receiving some sort of message, whether you're actually verbally saying something or not. So now part of this class is, about improving our communication competence. It's about improving how we engage with other people in our interpersonal relationships. And so there's three aspects that we need to consider when we're looking to improve on communicating, which should be a lifelong process, right? I don't think anybody ever reaches the point where they're like, okay, I'm a perfect communicator. That's just not true. Nobody is a perfect communicator. There's always room for growth. And so it begins by by gaining the knowledge, right? Understanding not only the communication process, the different dynamics of interpersonal communication, but knowledge of yourself, being aware of how it is that I communicate. How is it that, I engage in this process, right? One of your assignments to start off with is you're going to do a SWOT analysis on yourself, meaning that you're going to analyze your own ways of communicating and identify some of the strengths, some of your weaknesses, maybe opportunities for you to go out and be able to improve your communication, but then some threats that are present that kind of could inhibit your ability to communicate or continue to grow. So these things are key to be aware of, because when we are more aware of our own ways of communicating, we can understand how it comes off to other people. And then we want to develop our skills, right? And the best way to do that is just to practice. It's to engage in conversation. Is to use that knowledge that we have and engage with one another. We'll have various assignments throughout this semester that are going to really help hone those skills. But it goes beyond this classroom, right? when you're engaging with other people, really take that knowledge and put it to use. Put yourself in situations that even if they're uncomfortable, put yourself in situations that help you grow as a communicator. And the best way to do that is to continue to communicate. And then ultimately, you have to have the motivation to become a better communicator. You can have the knowledge, you can have the skills, but if you're not motivated to actually use them, then it doesn't matter, right? You can have them up here, but if you're not actually walking it out, then the improving won't take place. So I have to have that motivation to want to be a better communicator. There's unfortunately, been times where I've communicated with people that are perfectly fine being like, I'm not a good communicator. And that's fine. Maybe if you struggle in certain areas, that's perfectly fine. We all have those. However, we should all be striving to improve, because the more we improve on it, the better our whole life will become. There have been multiple studies done that show an overwhelming amount of evidence that when we have healthier relationships with people, we live a happier, longer, and healthier life. Overall, the quality of life is dramatically related to our relationships. And relationships are founded on communication. We can't have those healthy relationships if we don't find a way to communicate with one another. And so it's important that we have that motivation, that fire within us to be able to want to continuously improve so that we can engage in those relationships more effectively and healthily. So this is just the start, right? This is lecture 1. We've got a long semester here of just a bunch of content to be able to provide us with those knowledge and skills, and hopefully with a little bit of motivation to be able to continue to improve on our communication. As always, dive into the readings, engage in our discussions and our reflection posts, and the assignments. But if you have any questions, always reach out. Reach out to me and let me know if you have any questions. But other than that, I will see you next week.